So I'm going to start right at the beginning in terms of introducing some topics and themes and letting you guys get to know me as well. So in terms of my background and my upbringing, I am one of 3 girls. I have an incredible role model in my mother, who is very successful in her own career. I went to an all-girls school, and so actually I got all the way to the age of 18 without anyone telling me there were things I couldn't do and things I couldn't achieve. And to be honest, by the time I was 18, I was precocious enough to say, do you know what, whatever, watch me. And there's something really important, and we know this about representation, and actually the stories we tell and the narratives we tell, particularly when we're thinking about women and girls and the possibilities and what they contribute to society. So I think it's a really important thing which I recognize and I feel very fortunate for, but is also important when we start to think about how do we start to bridge this gap and open up this world to more women and girls. And often when we think about representation, role models, narratives, and the possible, we actually go straight to young girls and women and we talk about school and how do we have those influences at school and in the home. But it's really, really important that we also consider that more broadly for women as they go through their careers and their lives. There's a wonderful book that I love called The 100-Year Life, and it talks about, and it was introduced as chapters, if we're going to live that long, right, we are going to have different chapters of our lives. We're going to go through different phases. We're going to reskill and we're going to retrain. And I want us to encourage each other and society to think about how do we keep that narrative open for women at all stages of their career, to say these things can be possible, these things are accessible to you, these things are an option for you, and maybe you might make a career change. So that's my kind of first observation, I think, through my story is we're quite good now at doing the narrative of how do we make this possible, particularly for young girls, but why aren't we thinking about that more through mid-careers, through late careers, and actually career transitions and bringing people into our world later on? It's really important for the big reason as well. So women represent 52% of the world's population, and there's an estimated 29 trillion of economic potential that is untapped currently by women who are not engaged in the workforce or engaged in sectors which aren't contributing as highly. So we've got this burning platform, particularly when we look at progress for all, of saying how do we bridge that narrative, how do we start to open up ideas and have a dialogue which allows women to see things are possible, whatever stage you're at in terms of your career. If I zoom forward a little bit in my own story, and actually I guess when I started some of my STEM journey, if you like, I applied to the military age 15 and a half, and I knew exactly what I wanted to be. I was going to be a pilot, and I applied to be a pilot. And I was at a pretty in-depth, quite intense selection procedure at RAF Cranwell. You're there for a couple of days, interviews, medical testing, physical testing, etc. And really early on, they turned around and said, "You're not going to be a pilot. You're too short. I am physically too short to be a pilot. My arms are too short and I don't weigh enough." And it was that moment of, but that was what I was going to do. And then the option open, we had the discussion around becoming an engineer. But it was also my first real experience of feeling like the world was not designed for me. It's a pretty niche experience, right? But it's one which has been reflected later on in my career in the military. So as it was kind of alluded to earlier, I started working on tanks, and you're both maintaining and engineering on tanks, but you also have to drive them. And when I started doing my driver training, I'd have to take the backrest off, put it under my seat so I could see out, and I was actually capable to drive. And yes, I'm a very short person. I'm wearing high heels. I'm 5'1" without them on. But you see it across lots of society, and this is the burning why of why we have to get women into STEM. If we are building, if we are designing, if we're developing, and if we're innovating technology for use, it has to represent the needs of the entire population, not 48% of it. And the big obvious examples of this, many of you will know and have heard of. So there's the kind of less physical end of it, where Google and Siri voice activation, when they first launched them, had a preference for male voices and would pick up male questions more strongly than they did female questions. There is the very practical element around actually things like office temperatures and all the research that went into office temperatures and what was good working environments was done based on a male metabolism, and a female metabolism is 30% faster, and therefore it's not a productive or an optimum productivity level temperature for women in the workplace. And then there's a really serious end, where road traffic accidents are 47% more likely to have a high injury rate and 17% more likely to lead to fatalities for women. because crash test dummies were all done on a male anatomy. And so this is a burning why of why we need female voices and female representation in industries where we're designing, developing, innovating, and creating, because they're creating for our world, and at the minute it's at the exclusion of women broadly. When I first started off in the Army, as I said, I was working in engineering, and that was a path I'd taken. I'd been sponsored to study engineering. I had a bursary. I studied aeronautical engineering, but actually, as you guys know, they're principles and they apply to different things. So I did go into work on armor, on Challenger tanks, on some of the vehicles which we use more broadly. They're open architecture. They're not tanks, but they're designed to be heavily armored. And actually, engineering principles apply. And that was a really interesting point in my career where you start to think about what does this actually mean and what practically am I doing versus the very specific thing that I've studied. And this kind of brings me on to my third theme, really. I transitioned out of what you'd call strict engineering and being an engineer quite quickly in the Army. I got the opportunity to start working in intelligence, and that was fascinating to me. And what I started to notice was whilst I was an engineer, I was really just using principles of engineering to do whatever I wanted to do. So what I realized I was really good at and why I could do well at intelligence was I was actually good at taking complex components, building them into systems, and then working out how they added value to a situation. So it's engineering in terms of thinking, but obviously I was working with parts of information rather than physical components. And this was something I got really excited about because it felt more like a mindset and it opened up all these possibilities to me of things I could do and ways in which I could use my skills. And it actually helped me reconcile as well a little bit with a really creative side of myself. So not only the roles I was interested in, how my training and my education was going to benefit them, but also I recognized that it was why I'm drawn to actually doing a lot of sewing at home, because it's about building and creating and taking component parts and making something of them. And it's all this mindset, and it's about transferable skills, rather than putting myself in a box and saying, I am an engineer. I'm really good at complex problem solving. And all of a sudden, my horizons open, and my world changes, and there are all these different things I can do. So that's something I wanted to offer up, because I think it's an important part when we think around the stories we tell and the narratives, is we run the risk of actually constraining ourselves by saying, this is science, this is technology, this is engineering, and this is mathematics, when we think about STEM. And that's where actually we're potentially not creating an attractive environment or a welcoming environment for a broader section of women to join. The word engineer actually is a relatively recent word. It stemmed from when we had engines, and it was created to be the person who is maintaining and operating the engine. And it's now obviously much, much more broad, but it does narrow down our field in terms of what it means. And obviously I'm speaking from my perspective, but those of you who work in science, or if you work in programming or work in coding, you'll know that actually it's this incredibly broad field, and we end up with disciplines and subdisciplines and subcategorizations. And that can actually be unhelpful, because as much as women don't want to be put in a box and be told what they can and can't do, we're putting certain careers in a box and saying, this is what it looks like, and this is who can access it, and this is for you, or it's not for you. And so I really like this idea of actually bringing it down to first principles. What are we actually talking about? What are we doing? And then can we start to open that narrative, and does it become more accessible for different people? The other side of this, which I think is really interesting, my first comparable, when I was thinking about why I was actually a pretty good intelligence officer and why I was better than some people that have been trained specifically in that, is I was watching them and they were really good at getting information, really good at finding information. But I was good at doing the value add. And I think that was something I had from understanding engineering. It's all about what is the value add? What are we trying to achieve? What is the optimum outcome we're going for? And then the other side of engineering is how do you minimize actually what you need in order to get that? So it's about the minimum possible requirements and components to get the maximum outcome. And actually, that was really, really powerful in terms of what I wanted to do. And there's a very strong comparable between actually editing as well. And this is what I love about comparables and skills. So actually, if you're looking for someone who can distill complex information, really synthesize it into what is the value add, and think about actually what is the minimum requirement that I need to get the optimum outcome, editors and editorial writers are excellent at that. And this is where we can start to see skills in different fields that might become useful to us, particularly in fields of things like data analytics, programming, dealing with code, where we risk being absolutely inundated with information. We need people who can get to the critical really, really quickly of what matters. So if I fast forward a little bit further on in my career, I went from kind of intelligence actually to working in the NATO headquarters in Brussels in a defense diplomacy role. And this was when I started to get this idea of, what is the value add, but also how do we focus on the outcomes? So at the NATO headquarters, you have all of the kind of military heads of defense and the ambassadors who think about how collectively the NATO nations will ensure the security of Europe and those that have joined NATO. And it's incredibly complicated in terms of policy. You've obviously got an incredible arsenal of technology and software and capability and communications available to these organizations. And the thing that I noticed when working there is that none of that matters unless you think about the human element of it. None of it matters. If you're trying to make progress and you're trying to create change, technology does not exist without the cultural adaptation and the human behaviors behind it. And this is the other part which I think we have the opportunity to break open, welcome people from different backgrounds into a technology discussion, and actually get much more rapid adoption of what we're trying to push and technologies that can be really positive for the environment. And also potentially think about the user a little bit more. The use cases I talked about earlier where we've got it wrong. And this is where you start to see actually how you can bring particularly women into a technology conversation without them necessarily having to be qualified as engineers or software programmers or developers. And so when we think about that, it's about asking the end user. And often when we're thinking about, defense policy and what we're going to do, it's very much about what will be the cultural reaction to this? What are the needs of the population? What are the needs of the women in the population, particularly? That's become a much better conversation. Or if you're thinking about technology, how will this be used? Who is going to be using this? And so the first thing we can do is just bring the user, or actually the customer, or the recipient of whatever we think we're developing or bringing to the world into the conversation. And we can bring more women in actually without having doing that thing of how do we get them through university, how do we get them through an engineering degree, how do we get them through a mathematics degree? Just bring them into the conversation. The second part of it is also how do we think about the different skills required for that? So actually what you really want in that conversation when you're thinking about how I've got this brilliant technology and I want to change the world with it, you need a really great marketing person. And actually there are a lot of women in marketing. It's one of the industries where we have quite high populations of women. You need someone who understands complex data analysis, and human behaviors, because that's how we actually deploy technologies, that's how we make them stick, that's how we think about influencing adoption. And so again, we can start to think, what are the backgrounds, what are the profiles, who do we want to bring into our world? And do they have to be a woman in STEM? Or actually, could they just be a woman, arguably, who's got a different skill set and can think about how we bring technology into the world? And then I had another comparable in terms of where you've got different disciplines and kind of cross-pollinations, particularly that I observed during my time at NATO. So you've got the big kind of meeting room, which all of the nations sit around, big round table, NATO logo in the middle. You can sort of imagine, mahogany tables, very dark, very grand. And then around the outside, you've got a separate circle of offices and audio control booths. And you have a live translator for every one of the representatives whose first language is not English. And so you have a set of linguists who are listening live to incredibly complex defense diplomacy, immediately translating and speaking into an earpiece of whoever's representing their country. Every single translator I saw in 2.5 years there was a woman. And again, languages are an area where women excel. What's coding? What's programming? It's just another language. And so we've got to break open this narrative that says, actually, if you can learn a second language, and we're in London, most people in London are speaking their second language absolutely brilliantly, astoundingly. If you can learn a second language, you can learn to code. You can learn to program. And you can do pattern recognition really, really well. You understand that. And so how do we open those opportunities up to women? We hold up the mirror and start to say, this is something that could be for you. This is something you're good at. And we turn the narrative around. And that kind of brings me to my final chapter, I guess, of talking through my career and now having joined the corporate world. So through my military career, you move jobs quite a lot. It's quite natural. You're posted, and I was really doing that. How do my skills apply? How do I use basic skills that I've got? Not put myself in a box and say I'm an engineer, but think about what I enjoy doing, what I'm great at, and how I can apply that. And when I was leaving, I had the same open mind. I knew what I wanted to work on. I wanted to work on countering climate change, and I wanted to work on gender equality for women and girls. They're the two things I'm passionate about. And I joined a mammoth corporate. For those who aren't aware of Schneider Electric, it is a huge global business, about 127,000 people globally, and we work in almost every single sector there is, and it's an energy management and sustainability organization. So we make electrical components, solutions, systems, software, and apps to help people manage their energy and gain sustainability across all the different sectors you can imagine. I had no idea about business. I had no idea really about electrical power and infrastructure. I had no idea about Schneider Electric, to be perfectly honest with you, when I first heard of them. And I think the thing which was encouraging for me is I'd taken what were principles that I understood and I knew I could apply, and I'd learned through my degree, and I'd learned by being an engineer, but I felt really confident about applying them in a different way. And the really interesting thing, and this is where the sort of title of, I guess, this session has come from, is I didn't feel scared to ask people about things. How do we do this? Why do we do this? And this is a really important thing when we're talking about STEM, because ultimately when we talk about science, technology, engineering, or maths, all of that is just how and why everything in the world works. It's all it is if we get really simple about it. And as kids, we're really good at asking why. Who's got kids in the room? Do they ask why? Do they ask how? Yeah, I got a good roll of the eyes all the time, all the time. And at some point we stop doing that. And particularly women stop doing that. And even women who are curious and who are in these sectors and who are pushing the boundaries, you enter a workplace where you are the only one, where you probably feel like you have to push and be smarter and work harder and be better than everyone there to justify your position. And so actually asking why is a really hard thing to do, even as a woman in a research area or an engineering area, because we're trying to prove our point. So all of that brilliant tendency, all of the questions we need to ask, everything that the industry needs, we're societally limiting because we're putting people and women in a position that they don't feel they belong. So we stop asking why. And if I fast forward to what we need now, and so we work in the sustainability business, that's what Schneider is here to deliver. And if I think about the jobs of the future and what the future needs, we need to work out an economic model that works for everybody and genuinely works for everybody. We need to work out a method of business and of innovating and of creating that can move us forward as society whilst also not breaking our planet. And what will get us there is not how we've done things in the past. And ultimately, we need people who are prepared to ask why and prepared to say we don't know. And there's a wonderful quote I love. It's certainty breeds mediocrity. And if we take that, the most important thing we can ever do is say, I don't know, but let's work out how, and let's maybe ask the questions why. And this is a value, I think, actually, when we talk about what are we getting at when we say we want to bring more women into STEM? What's the benefit of it? And people will say it's bringing diversity, it's difference of thought, it's creativity, it's innovation. And that is what we need. We need a different way of thinking, bringing a different angle. And therefore, we've got to rip up this narrative which has been built through history, built by men for men, in terms of how we categorize things, and is still excluding large proportions of women from these areas. It's particularly important when we think about the green agenda, because there is going to be a huge amount of investment, a huge amount of jobs created to actually deliver a sustainable future. And they're all going to be in manufacturing, construction, software design, coding. They're all going to be sectors which traditionally we are struggling to get women into, and they're going to create automation, and they're going to use AI, which are going to decimate the sectors that women currently work in. And PwC have done an amazing piece of work around, if we go on our current trajectory towards delivering particularly a green UK and the agenda that we've got there and the investment that's going on there, we will widen the gender gap in terms of pay and equity in the UK by 1.5 points for the West. The wrong way, to be clear. And so it's particularly important that we start to think, what are we trying to achieve and how do we open up the narrative a little bit more? So my encouragement actually here is that we stop using the boxes. We stop saying this is what an engineer is, this is what a scientist is, this is what it means to work in technology. And we start to broaden our horizons a little bit as well of what are the skills and the transferable skills that we could bring in. And I'll use an example to kind of highlight this and the idea of cross-pollination. And how do we open our arms, particularly to more women, and say, there's a place for you here and we want you in the dialogue. I was sat next to an amazing woman who at a dinner recently, who is a fashion designer. She's an entrepreneur. She just launched a clothing line, and she makes her clothing from orchid. And she's growing orchid all over the world, giving back to communities. And when she was talking about her business, all of her passion and fire came from actually the material science part of it. And she was so excited about creating this new material and testing it and seeing what she could do with it. And I was thinking in my head, why don't we have women like this working on new methods of construction and thinking about materials that we put in our buildings? And how can we start to create a space that says, we need you in the room? And no, your qualification is not what we traditionally look for, but what we traditionally look for will not take us into the future. So really what I'm proposing is actually we collectively say, how do we change the narrative, starting with young girls? And we say, walk in, daughters are maybe mixing pancake mix in the morning. Oh my goodness, you're doing chemistry. Tell me about that. What's going to happen when you mix those things? What's going to happen when you add heat to it? Why does it do that? But also leads all the way through to other women. When we meet women and we understand what their key skills are and we understand what they're contributing, whether it's in fashion, whether it's in editing, whether it's in social care, whether it's in marketing, and we say, what could you contribute to this world? And how can we bring you into that discussion, because it's all holistic? And hopefully, therefore, we can create, build, design, and develop things for the future which represent everyone. Thank you very much.
And I've got some questions of my own. One thing I wanted to pick up on was what you mentioned at the start, which is obviously about kind of referring to the data gap and not having that data for women. So, for example, the Siri, the voice. We actually have the founder of Siri here today, so maybe you can ask him. But and also things like test dummies being, designed as, male bodies. So, what is the answer to this? How can we lessen the data gap, and is it getting women in the industry?
Yeah, I think quite simply, actually, if we're doing any kind of market research, or we think about doing a product launch, we've got to ask the end user that represents the end user. Mm-hmm. I think it's the quickest way of getting women in the conversation, as we said. We can't wait all of the years for people to go through all of the training, but bring them in the room and make sure actually you've got, a scientific representation of the audience that you're trying to meet.
Mm-hmm. And something that, a question we had asked online here, you were talking about kind of the skills that females have, and you said what you were good at. What skills are unique to women that tech businesses can actually benefit from?
Unique to women is a really interesting phrase. So I think biologically women are better have stronger verbal recall skills. Mm-hmm. But I think there's this interesting thing around, again, we don't want to put things in boxes. So it's really about people knowing what their unique skills are. So I have come through one route and I studied in one way, and actually someone even on my course, another woman on my course may have very different key skills. So I think it's really about understanding what you can bring. Mm-hmm. There is an interesting thing actually around women's ability, and why the biggest proportion of women in the UK work in social care, for example, is actually empathy, picking up on what people need, and caring and taking an interest. And if you think about product use, that's incredibly useful because you're really getting to the heart of what your customer might need.
Fantastic. And just to wrap up the Q&A, obviously some people here are interested in your career at Schneider. So I wondered if there was anything you could kind of give us some insights. What drew you to the company? You said you weren't really familiar with it before. So was there some, women initiatives that were there that drew you to it initially?
So I love the mission, number one, because it spoke to both the sustainability and the gender equality piece at Schneider. So we're 28% female representatives, which is not where we'd want to be, but there's real great initiatives around it. So I was drawn to that environment. I think the second thing was I had so many people say to me as I was discovering, great people work here and they work really hard. And that's me all over. I wanted to work around amazing people, and nothing's been truer, to be honest. I can say that very much is the case.
Fantastic. All right, so that's wrapping up today's session. Thank you for kicking off the stage today, Alice. It's much appreciated. We hope you can hang around and hopefully answer some questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.